this is not quite the same as in the rest of the world. And this gives rise to some questions as to whether the hydrogen infrastructure is ready if we're not seeing renewables yet in the grid at scale. Whether or not that comment is fair is another matter, but still that comment is out there. Now, given that bad news, let's have a look at some good news, potentially. The International Maritime Organization has got fairly clear market signals for shipping decarbonization. In 2018, there was an ambition to have only 10%, only 50% decarbonization by 2050. The IMO surprised everyone by 2023. This was moved to a net zero target by 2050 with various intermediate targets. With an additional target that by 2030, which is not that far away, some 5% of energy used in maritime shipping should come from zero or net zero fuels. Now, this is the emerging or the inklings of a market. But April of this year, the IMO committed to the rules of, not yet the implementation, but the rules of a new net zero framework. The world's first globally binding carbon tax mechanism. And there are two components, a technical measurement and an economic compliance measure. The technical measure is a fuel standard, where the fuel used in shipping, the greenhouse gas allowable impact is managed downwards from the current value of 93 grams of carbon per megajoule to, are you guys okay here? All right. We're having a committee session here. Look up here. Managing the 93 grams of carbon per megajoule to essentially zero in 2050. And there are two lines, which you can see over here. That is the current emissions factor of heavy fuel oil, and that's the allowable line. So you see there's a base target and a direct compliance target. Then there's an economic compliance measure. Vessels which fail to meet that target, if they exceed their emissions, if you exceed that first line, you pay $100 per ton of CO2 emitted or CO2 equivalent. If you miss that line, if you miss the more basic line, you pay an additional $380 a ton. So this is the stick which then drives the uptake of decarbonization. There's a carrot. All this money must go somewhere. And that goes into the IMO fund. And that fund, the goal of the fund is not to make money. It then gets disbursed. Okay. Is this going to work? Wow. Okay. So this money is used to reimburse vessels that use the expensive net zero fuels. This now becomes the underpinning of a potential market, a bulk market, a global market. If we look at what are options for maritime bunker fuels, there's biofuels and there's e-fuels. E-fuels might come from green hydrogen. Biofuels are your easiest option. If you've got the rainfall, if you've got the land, if you've got the climate, biofuels are the way to go. They create economy in rural areas. They provide employment and so on. But not all countries share those benefits. Many countries are water stressed. South Africa is one of them, and many other countries in Africa. So e-fuels then become the only real possible alternative for sustainable fuels. For shipping, it's ammonia, and you only need nitrogen from the atmosphere. But you need new vessels or significantly retrofitted vessels, and your engines need modification. Methanol is similar. You also need modified engines, modified vessels. And you need carbon from an acceptable source. If you have a Fischer-Tropsch facility, you can make a drop-in fuel, which means you have a much larger market that you can address. And you have the benefit that you are making aviation fuel at the same time. Because when you have a Fischer-Tropsch facility, you produce both longer chain and shorter chain hydrocarbons, and this gives you a particular opportunity. You can see the combined solar and wind resource around the world. The redder the color, the better the opportunity. And South Africa is relatively well placed for that. Now, not only do you want to know how well you can make the fuels, but the beauty of maritime shipping is that the customer comes to you. One of the disadvantages of some emerging markets is they're far from the final market. And that transport requirement that is imposed makes your opportunity less attractive. With shipping, however, as I said, the customer will. Did I go right to the end? Sorry, apologies. The customer comes to you, and you can see various areas where international shipping is constrained, and moving around the Cape gives you one of those visualizations. The various ports around the world, 114 high traffic ports, where you see that we'll see what they are, and bunkering. Bunkering is particularly heavy in Singapore. Singapore, however, does not have the renewable resources, so therefore they need to be supplied with sustainable fuels. Here you can see where low emission hydrogen is produced near many ports, 130 odd, with where it's possible for various South African ports, the various cargoes being dry bulk, essentially iron ore from Saldanha Bay, tanker and container ports for Durban. Existing and announced port infrastructure gives an indication of what is possible, and there are planned green corridors. One green corridor specifically from Saldanha Bay. It's our main iron ore export port. It is our deepest deepwater port, about 21 meters. So while the international export market may not have got there yet, the maritime shipping market is looking interesting. Now, I mentioned that the rules had been agreed to in April this year. They get adopted next week in London. This is a very, very good time in the green hydrogen space. If we look at Fischer-Tropsch facilities, this is my second last slide. These are Fischer-Tropsch facilities around the world. There are two on this major shipping route. Those controlled by Sasol, those controlled by Petro SA. There's a very small facility in Brazil. There is a reasonable facility in Nigeria. This color is wrong. It should actually be Nigeria over here. So the fact that we have this infrastructure means that we repurpose them for a different application, and that could be a major uptake possibility. So, ports are natural hubs for development. Ports are normally located close to special economic zones, and the manufacturing of those fuels also allows hydrogen to be available to decarbonize operations within the ports. Tugs are particularly large local emitters, and the maritime decarbonization can provide that business case for the hydrogen economy to take off, where we are struggling to get this large-scale bulk offtake. And that is the end of my presentation. I'm going to hand over to Rebecca now. I'm sorry, I thought I did. Okay. I don't know. Yes, ma'am.
Sorry about that. I did see that obviously the presentation included a part on the IMO regulations or the framework that has been set out in terms of reduction targets, right? But in August of this year, we've seen a statement by the US where they aim to retaliate against IMO members that back the emissions plan by the IMO. But I mean, in October, then we'll know, obviously, the vote would require, I think, a 2/3 majority. So I just wanted to understand from you as an expert, what do we see would happen or is likely to happen, given that the US has threatened to...
I want to contrast what happened then with what happened when the IMO made these adoptions in April. The US administration made similar threats then when the rules were being made. And the IMO, to their credit, didn't fold. It was an astonishing thing to see. So it was a difficult period. It was the midst of the Ukraine conflict. The Israel conflict had been going for quite some time, and so it was the first 3-4 months of the new U.S. administration. There was uncertainty as to what would happen, but the IMO stuck to their guns and said, "These are the rules. We're going to go with that." The IMO was threatened with or rather, various countries were threatened with punitive measures, but it still went through. So I'm not a politician. I am an engineer. For me to make any pronouncement about political likelihood is going way outside my wheelhouse. But I am cautiously optimistic.
Thank you so much, Thomas. Maybe I would like to invite now Dr. Rebecca, who will deliver the keynote speech. Over to you. Thank you.
No, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. I will say that so many years ago, over 2 decades ago, when I first moved to South Africa, CSIR was one of the first organizations to give me an opportunity to be employed post my PhD. So I always have a special place in my heart for the CSR. So I'm grateful to be here this morning. I recently moved to my new role, which is Program Director for Green Hydrogen at the Just Energy Transition Implementation Plan, PMO at the IDC. And I recall when I was doing my high school and I was at my math teacher was like, wanting to write me a recommendation. She said, "Look, I'll write your recommendation as long as you consider being a teacher, but never a banker." So like going full circle, it took me over 30 years to break that promise working at a DFI, but hopefully the work I'm going to do is respectable enough to make up for that. So I think for me, I think, I'm sorry, it's just not, I'm not sure why it's not making, and so forth, but it's fine. It's around creating foundations for hydrogen infrastructure development in South Africa, EU. And actually yesterday when I saw Thomas at the G20 event, he said he was going to use IEA information. So I said, look, I'm not going to use IEA information. I'm going to use Hydrogen Council information. So hopefully, Charles, you're okay with that because you're a member. Air Products is a member of the Hydrogen Council. And for those who may not know, Hydrogen Council started in 2017. I think on the sidelines of a COP meeting. I think it was like 10 or 11 organizations. And I think now most of your hydrogen leaders in business are members of that. So, periodically they release reports around hydrogen. And recently, a few months ago, they released a report called the Global Hydrogen Compass. So in that report, this is one of the graphs I thought was very compelling. And it just gives a snapshot of the committed investment in clean hydrogen projects by 2030. And this is in billions of dollars. And what it's saying is that, we've had an increase in projects which are at final investment decision plus, so either FID, they're either in construction or fully operational currently. And this is not just renewable, but clean, which means you can have blue and green. But I think it's important to know that this $110 billion is projects which are across 510 projects. And this is up from 35 billion from the last year. And if you look at the graph, we're growing 50% year on year since 2020. And really, I think there has been an attrition. There was a lot of hype. Also, a lot of the green deals post COVID were making people really happy. And then what you've seen is an attrition where projects which aren't bankable are being publicly announced as not going forward. And there's even projects that are not going forward that haven't announced. So even then, the numbers are not there. But I think what was important to me isn't always the numbers, but the qualitative analysis that's happened through interviews with CEOs. And I think this is where the Hydrogen Council can speak to their members and say, what is your sentiment around this issue? And I think, one of the outcomes of the interview process was, and like I said, they spoke to 70 leaders from across the world on hydrogen. 7 of 10 respondents indicated their investment appetite in clean hydrogen projects has either remained stable or increased in the last 2 years. So we are seeing an attrition, but there is still leadership is still believing in it. Respondents believe 3 out of 10 believe that China is far ahead. I mean, it's obvious the numbers, you see them, shaping the global hydrogen economy as a dominant leader. And I mean, even when we had gray hydrogen, they were a dominant leader. So it's not surprising that they're going to still do that in the clean hydrogen space. And then I think the last statistic I'm going to communicate is 8 of 10 respondents believe that the pipeline is maturing and expect clean hydrogen to have a significant role in energy systems in general. And I think, Thomas, this is almost piggybacking or at least echoing some of the sentiment that you communicated from the IEA information. And I think, like I said, we talk about demand and supply, clean, having issues around the pipeline and so forth. But issues of infrastructure did actually creep up as one of the challenges for that. So I think our conversation today is really important. But before I progress, I think it's always important to know who's speaking to you. Do I have the background or qualifications to speak to you? I think, first of all, I really have a job because in 2023, Cabinet approved the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan. And really that investment plan sets out how we're going to have investments in the just transition over the next 4 years. And like I said, there's 3 priority sectors: electricity, new energy vehicles, green hydrogen, of which I'm leading the green hydrogen portfolio. And then there's 2 cross-cutters: municipalities as well as skills development. And I think, we don't, in terms of the 1.5 trillion over 5 years expected to be implemented, we are making some progress. I know in our portfolio, we announced funds from the KfW. We have funds from the Dutch coming in. So it is moving, and most of the implementation, because it is money, is happening through either MDVs or your DFIs like IDC or DBSA. And essentially, the link of my team into the presidency is there's a green hydrogen PMO I lead, and then we report directly into the presidency for strategic issues. We have a green hydrogen advisory committee, which is made up of key stakeholders from across government, civil society, SOEs, and private sector. So the chair of that is Mr. Masopa Mashweshwe, who's the minister's advisor for green hydrogen. And then we have a project developers forum, which is made up of private sector in South Africa who have projects on the ground. And we have 7 work streams that report into me. And I think critical to understand is that we're not a one-stop shop. We're not here to replicate. We're really around alignment, integration, and visibility. So ensuring that we're the preferred contact. So not the only contact, but we believe we're the preferred point of contact for green hydrogen, and actually interview stakeholders. We establish committees, advisory committees. But I think, last but not least, I think probably where we probably have the most impact is around making sure there's a pipeline of projects that move forward. So my activities are focused on getting the projects across the finish line, from pre-fees to feasibility to feed to FID. Anything else is a distraction for us on the team. And if we have to mobilize funding for studies and so forth, we support both private sector as well as public sector in this. And this is something that's pretty different that you've seen from the past. And this is the team, beautiful faces, so I have, of course, had to show them. So I think I'm going to drill down into today's discussion. So when the JET IP document was published, it said for the green hydrogen space, there's 7 challenges, and for each challenge there's a work stream. And I'm going to focus on what we're doing around shared infrastructure, because that's what we're discussing today. So if I drill down into the shared infrastructure work stream, and I think what's critical about our structure is each work stream is actually chaired by an institution. So the one for shared infrastructure is the IDC. So they must put together the teams, get nominations from different departments, different SOEs, different provinces. I think the shared infrastructure work stream includes the 3 Capes because of the infrastructure, as well as Gauteng. I don't know how they got in there, but hey, don't ask questions. And then also we have Transnet pipelines, Transnet ports. We also have Transnet corporate, as well as ESCOM because of transmission distribution, and so forth. I'm not sure if CSIR was invited yet, but I can't remember, as well as other groups of stakeholders. And I would say the key activities that are going to have an impact on how we do common user infrastructure is the National Infrastructure Master Plan for Green Hydrogen, which looks at from the electron moving to the molecule moving and everything in between. So you may need road, you may need rail, you need transmission. And, initially we're talking about the IRP, but the renewables required for the green hydrogen space are enormous. It's in the gigawatts. And we're going to make sure we can move the electron for the molecule to be produced. But we're going to need desalination plants. We're going to need port infrastructure. So this will do that, but also allow us to understand where we can share infrastructure and when the state needs to step in to play a role, at least in terms of backing funding. And then what I'm going to drill in on is our project development standard template. So you really can't plan unless you know what is the group of projects coming down the pipeline, where they are in the process, how much you need, how they fit into the big picture toward each other. So in terms of the project development standard template, essentially the goal is to create a standard template for submission of information shared in a portal to enhance project bankability and attract international investment. So this is what we're embarking upon. And the clear outcomes are ensuring that we have a standard approach to how projects meet minimum technical, financial, environmental, and social due diligence criteria. So having a project that brings potable water as an input into your green hydrogen production is something that needs to be stamped out, but people do it. And ensuring that the ESG components of projects are similar across, but you can also compare, especially if you're using the same template. The second outcome is reducing uncertainty for investors by signaling that projects are well-structured, feasible, and aligned with global best practice. And we're actually working with some of the DFIs, MDBs around this. And then investors gain confidence that data and assumptions are reliable and comparable across projects. And this is so important because if you have the information, you aggregate data, you aggregate demand, you understand the requirements for for infrastructure. Then what you get is you get an investment-ready pipeline of green hydrogen and PTX projects. So we're not looking at equipment manufacturers, just PTX. So green steel, ammonia, hydrogen, fertilizer, and so forth. I think value proposition, I'll go really quickly. Infrastructure South Africa, they have the SIPs, but as we're learning, the SIPs that were gazetted years ago may or may not be relevant anymore because of the natural attrition. So we've met with Infrastructure South Africa to say, can we revive that process and use a more stringent process for doing SIPs for green hydrogen? And they've agreed. DEE, DTIC, you can't do oversight if you don't know what's happening. So they do oversight of ESCOM easily because it's a vertically integrated system. You know what's happening, you have the data. So we're looking to do that for proper oversight. Financiers, again, provides standardized bankable project information, enhances investor confidence, and reduces perceived risk. And then for project developers, and really I feel for them. I mean, you can submit a proposal and wait months to receive feedback. And our premise is that you're going to receive feedback quickly, and only projects which are viable will go through the full DD process, again, utilizing limited resources in the best way. And there's just a process flow. So we're looking to actually launch the expression of interest in March next year, and then with the view that hopefully over the next over a few months after that, we'll have like the list, because the process doesn't take long. And then I think, like I said, we're not looking at just bankability, but we're looking at issues of land use, renewable energy, operations technology, social economic benefits. Do you have offtake, and so forth. And then just sample questions in the questionnaire. And supposedly based on project developers who have filled in the questionnaire, it takes less than 60 minutes to fill in a questionnaire, 120 questions. So the time it takes you to drink a cappuccino, or a really good one, should be time in which you should be able to fill in the application if you have a reputable project. And then I think last but not least, really what's important is the back end dashboard that would be used to, once you get past to either, so if you don't have a good project, you'll be kicked out of the system. But if you have a viable project, it looks viable, then we'll collect information quarterly. And then those who are not quite there but need technical assistance, because the questionnaires are, are for the 10 areas, land, ESG, and so forth, we'll know actually where you need technical assistance, and they'll be able to, get you technical assistance for that area of focus. So the back end will then allow you to aggregate information and data from a geographical point of view, and hence hopefully understand the shared infrastructure requirements. So thank you so much for your time and attention. I hope I stayed to the 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca, for this wonderful keynote speech. I don't know if you have any questions for Rebecca. We did not think about the Q&A here, but if not, then we can move to the panel discussion. So, good morning, everyone. My name is Ruchi Gupta. I'm a senior researcher and project manager in VITO, which is a Belgium-based research organization. So, we are part of the Flemish government, and I have the opportunity to be the moderator of today's panel discussion. So, I would like to invite the panelists here on the stage, please. So, starting with Thomas. You already met Thomas. He's a principal research engineer in CSIR. Welcome, Thomas. So I would like to then invite Charles Dos Santos. He's a managing director, Air Products South Africa. Welcome, Charles. Next, we have Theopolina Kapani. She's the head technical and construction from Namibia Green Hydrogen Program. And we have two panelists who will join us remotely. So thank you for your presence. Can we show them on the screen, please? So we have here Shannon Newman. She's Associate Investment Facilitation in Freeport, Saldanha. And we have Ankur Malyan. He's the manager at the Rocky Mountain Institute India program. So I would like to welcome also the remote speakers. Just wanted to check if you can hear us. The way I think we will do the panel discussion today is we'll do more interactive way. So I think feel free to jump in if you think you want to add something rather than question and answer. So I think that will be more interesting. And at the end, we'll ask for question and answer from the audience. So yeah, I think just starting with, maybe I can pose a warm-up question to all the panelists. Yeah, just to give a background, we are here today. I think Thomas and Rebecca did a very good job of talking about the hydrogen landscape in South Africa. But today we are joined also with international speakers. So we have speakers from Namibia and India who will be also throwing their light on what's happening in their countries when we talk about hydrogen infrastructure and readiness for hydrogen export, basically, because they are the mostly the exporting countries for hydrogen, but also the use of hydrogen domestically and how this entire landscape would look like. And I think we must not forget, and we must talk about the hydrogen hype, because many people now talk about, okay, you're talking about hydrogen and is it going to survive? Because we saw this hydrogen hype 3 years back when everybody, 3-4 years back, when everybody was like, okay, hydrogen can be used for any sector, including residential heating. But I think now people are realizing that no, it's not for every sector, but it's really for hard to abate sector. And I think here everyone in this room agrees that electrification is the way to go forward. So whatever you can electrify, you do that, and you use hydrogen only for hard to abate sectors. So I think I don't think, this is my personal opinion, I don't think hydrogen is going to die. Of course, the hype has gone down, but the sectors who are the real off-takers are going to be there. But then the question, and one of the critical question, is around hydrogen infrastructure. So we have countries, we have, for example, the European Union. We have countries like Belgium, I'm coming from Belgium, Germany, Netherlands, who will import green hydrogen. But of course, they are also looking at other countries and the infrastructure, if the infrastructure is really ready. So in my opinion, the infrastructure readiness has to be on both the sides, both on the supply and the demand side, because if we have the supply side ready and the infrastructure is ready, but the demand or the off-takers are not ready to receive that hydrogen or its derivatives, then we are failing. So I think I think today is going to be an interesting debate to see from this perspective, and we also have Charles, who's from the private sector, to see, okay, how you're going to demystify this infrastructure, problem or this bottleneck. So I think the first question I would like to ask the panelists as a warm-up question. So take a minute or two to answer this. In your opinion, what are some of the key infrastructure challenges or gap that needs to be addressed for better adoption of green hydrogen, or to enable a scalable green hydrogen? So I think I'll start with you, Thomas.
I would say that in any economy you need a customer, and a customer only exists if he's prepared to pay an acceptable price for a given product. And identification of the customer has really been one of the key challenges in the hydrogen economy, where many folk have dived in and said, okay, fine, we've got solar, we've got wind, we can do this, we can produce megatons, where are the customers, why they're not here? And looking for those launch customers where you can provide value is absolutely critical. We've not seen the volumes for long-term offtake that justify export. There have been some exceptions, and we're very happy for those exceptions, but it's really hard to get there. The suggestion is that if you are going to be looking at what is going to move the needle, if maritime shipping fuels are to take off, no one is going to bunker if you don't have the bunkering infrastructure. You need to have the tank farms for ammonia, for methanol. They each have their own specific requirements. Not all ports have a history of chemical handling. If you don't have that history in chemicals handling, it's difficult to give that sense of comfort for investors, which really require a little bit of extra effort to go and get that across. I'm pretty sure Shannon will speak a little bit later. The Saldanha Bay is traditionally a dry bulk hub. South Africa has been trying to get landed liquefied natural gas and whatever for quite some time. That hasn't really sort of got across the line. But to attract the investment, you need the tank farm structured. You need an idea of who owns and operates those. You need to have an idea of where to locate those. When there's uncertainty even at that level, you're not going to get a little bit further. But I think Shannon will talk further about what's been happening under the master planning to move that forward.
Okay, so since you're talking about Shannon, I will talk. Shannon, if you can throw some light on the key challenges, infrastructure challenges from the port perspective.
Okay, thank you, Thomas, for that brief. And thank you, Ruchi. So, briefing on key infrastructure challenges or gaps from a Freeport perspective. I've got a mentor that says that she's got 10 fingers and she only uses 3 at a time. However, I'm not there yet, so I'm only pointing out 4 aspects. So from a Freeport perspective, we see the common user infrastructure versus the project-specific needs. With our green hydrogen or West Coast Green Hydrogen Master Plan, it rightly highlights the need for shared infrastructure. But the challenge lies in balancing this with the bespoke requirements of the individual developers. That is why the first one. The second one is the constraint in land and spatial planning, and also the aspect of the critical biodiversity implications thereof. Thirdly, we say the integration of a roadmap for global and local positioning, and then lastly, the investment and financing gap, unlocking blended financing for the public-private public-private partnerships is critical because shared infrastructure has a long payback periods or has long payback period, aligning with national programs like the JET-PMU, ISA, German corporations, etc., is essential to de-risk early investments. So from a Freeport perspective, that is the key challenges that we are facing with regards to common user infrastructure readiness.
Thanks a lot, Shannon. I think we are going to discuss in detail on that, but thanks for pointing out these infrastructure challenges. So I'll pass over to Theopalina for your views.
Thank you very much. Just to also piggyback off what Shannon has said, a key example is, of course, in our country, in Namibia, where we have projects which are moving faster than actually the development of our common user infrastructure that we've mapped out. So this is a key challenge because it essentially poses project-on-project risks. The sector is moving faster. The developers are moving faster. They're not going to wait for the common user infrastructure to come on board. But again, there's an advantage in that as well, because the first movers would have to essentially build out that infrastructure, and then obviously we'll see how the rest of them will plug in. But again, the key challenge is also just those project-on-project risks when we're looking at when we think common user infrastructure. But again, from a more nuanced perspective, and what we see on the ground in terms of Namibia is also limited grid infrastructure capacity. We are in the process of looking at how best we can address this, working very closely with our power utility, which is NamPower, because the grid stability and grid infrastructure constraints do pose a significant infrastructure challenge for the sector. And just beyond the infrastructure assets, the one challenge that we do see is with regards to the standards and certifications in the sector. Because you can have all the infrastructure that's ready, but if you do not have your codes, your cross-border certification standards up and running, or at least operational, you will still face serious challenges. So to address that, in Namibia, we are working very closely with DIN, which is the Deutsche Institut für Normen, to map out our adoption and the development of safety standards and just infrastructure standards for certification as well. So for us, those are some of the key infrastructure challenges that we do face.
Yeah. From a private perspective, what do you think are the key infrastructure challenges?
So, does this one work now?
Yeah.
Yes,
yeah,
it does.
it works.
Okay, great. So, this is not specifically due to the fact that I'm from the private sector, but the ideal scenario, because the market, and it comes back to what Thomas said earlier, the market doesn't exist yet. So, in the scenario that we sit with, let's look at the parts of the infrastructure that have common use beyond just the hydrogen market. Let's look more broadly. Let's look at the value chain as it is for the whole supply chain of this green hydrogen, green ammonia economy. And one of the very starting points, and Theopalina already touched on it, grid infrastructure. There's a huge demand for grid infrastructure in South Africa, in the region, not just in the South Africa economy itself. We all know that is a major constraint, and there are plans to roll out this infrastructure for the needs to meet the electricity needs of the country. But this is ideal for what we need as the green hydrogen, green ammonia economy, because once that grid infrastructure is in place, we can literally make green hydrogen, green ammonia anywhere in the country, in the region. Not to say that that's where the market is going to ideally want it, and obviously if you're going to focus on shipping or export, you've got to be closer to the coast. But the point of the matter is, hydrogen, green hydrogen can be made anywhere, as long as you can get the electrons, the green electrons, to that point. So I think there's a huge opportunity for, I'm going to specifically talk about South Africa, to accelerate the rollout of the grid infrastructure. in order to open up that opportunity for people to participate, small scale, large scale, in any scale, in that green hydrogen economy. The other challenge is, so far, if you look most of these projects, the larger scale projects at least, the project developers are having to look at the whole value chain. And that's also wrong. No one entity is the expert in all components. That brings, to me, a very high risk that you are going to get people trying to do things that they do not know how to do. And they're forced to do that sometimes by the financiers. Financiers love having one person, one party that they can go to. Actually, the real risk on the ground is trying to force one party to take all that responsibility. You need participants in the value chain that are best suited to those components. The next aspect we've already dealt with, so I don't need to go too much, is around really the transport corridors. And that's where the ports come in, the infrastructure around that has to open it up for whoever's able and willing to supply the product to be able to distribute. And a key element to green hydrogen, green ammonia, the more efficiently you can distribute it, the better. Why I'm saying this is because the cost of producing green hydrogen is only a small fraction of what it takes to get it to the end user. And this is often forgotten. I mean, in public domain, there's a lot of publicity that says $2 a kilogram, but that $2 does not give that hydrogen where it's anywhere where it's needed. It's a molecule sitting coming off a production plant at a very low pressure. What do you need to get it to the end user? By the time you get to the end user, and I saw something in a publication earlier today that stated that in Japan they were willing to pay 23 rand, not rand, dollar per kilogram. Wow. So that gives you a perspective of what potentially that value chain could add in cost to getting it to the end user. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Charles. And I think you touched upon the very critical point, and that's very good that I bring it to Ankur now. Ankur, I think you can hear us, and you heard Charles as well, right? So the question to you is the same, the warm-up question about the key infrastructure challenges. But since you will be taking on the mic, I would also ask you to go further and answer the first question on how, of course, you can give a perspective of India, like how India is positioning itself and what work you have done on the port readiness for both the hydrogen used domestically as well as export, and how far is India to be export ready. And I think you can focus on the key points which Charles also mentioned, and Theopolina on this grid infrastructure, because of course India is doing a lot and also has massive solar and wind potential. So India, of course, has that benefit that they are already ready. So I think you can take these 2 points and elaborate.
So from the grid perspective, if you look at India acts as a one grid, but there are different level of connections that you get. So the west coast in India is actually very rich in renewables. So you look at states like Rajasthan or Gujarat, they have like enormous renewable potential. But the combination of policy, which is on the east coast, is actually better. So you might be hearing about the east coast of India able to supply and produce at the economic rates right now. So getting the molecule or getting the electron from the west coast to east coast of India really needs an infrastructure that has to be there, which includes the substation, the wires, and the connectivity. So that's the one challenge, which is leading up to the real delay in the projects. The second challenge is the choice, which I think have already been spoken about, that the choice between common user infra and the private infra. Though there has been a natural push towards common user infra, but in India as well, majority of the players are trying to invest in their private infrastructure. So the ports have been trying to allocate land, and none of the storages have emerged as a common storage. The players who are actually investing in the project development and are trying to have their own storages. And the reason that we have been hearing from the developers is that they want to avoid any potential conflict and the situation where they want to use the infra and deliver to their consumers, and they are actually not able to do that because of some contract that exists. So that is the primary reason that exists for the infra. Obviously, as part of the challenge, policy, accountability, and cost becomes a situation. Until and unless you achieve a scale, the infrastructure won't make sense. The projects right now don't have any optics, so the volumes that are coming up is also low. At least our analysis says that at least you need 300 KTPA equivalent of handling to really have that economies of scale effect kick in, and you actually reach a point in the curve where you are stabilizing. That being said, I'll speak about the India strategy and what the India effort has been towards this both international markets as well as the domestic market. So the first one is starting with the what Ministry of Port Shipping and Waterways, Government of India is doing. What the ministerial action has towards the policy has been great, starting with the National Green Hydrogen Mission having an outlay of $2.4 billion that came for the incentives that can be provided across the hydrogen value chain. Beyond that, all the subnational states, whether it's and primarily the states where the hydrogen already being used in some form, because India already consumes hydrogen, approximately 7 million tons, gray form from natural gas. But the states who had these consumption centers already came up with policies, and which approximately range up to like $1 billion, outlay that came out in these policies. So investment is there. And what Ministry of Ports also did additionally is designating 3 ports in India as hydrogen hubs. Not that means that other ports are not doing enough, but these ports were positioned as the flagship ports to emerge as a hubs, and which also leads to a point that the target in the policy was 5 million metric tons, but because of the promises and the policy signals we had, the industry announced almost twice of it, more than 12 million tons worth of capacity was announced. And there might be slowdown because globally there is a slowdown on hydrogen uptake, but still approximately 30% of those projects that were announced are export oriented. Now, in terms of the port level readiness, you will be hearing that the ports have already allocated 4,500 acres worth of land at these 3 ports to, I think, top 5 to 6 developers that are emerging, ranging from Reliance and Adani's to Renews and Avadas that exist. There have been ports which are looking for unlocking investments of approximately 1.5 lakh crores INR with these efforts in place. Now, coming to the market as well, because at that, there is no point of having a production and an infrastructure until and unless the market is unlocked. So, Government of India recently undertook a reverse auction, which is very similar to what G-STIC Global was trying to do. But in India, we did for the fertilizer sectors, and 13 different fertilizer sectors were approximately 0.7 million tons of ammonia was run. The price point that has been discovered in the reverse auction is $600 per ton of ammonia, which is 45% less than what G-STIC Global auction could achieve previously. So overall, if I have to say that what India is trying to build is a dual use case model where the port is the anchor of it. The infrastructure has been the investment has been around infrastructure. The industries that exist in the vicinity of the port naturally acts as a demand center, and the ports and the government is keen on signing the bilateral agreements that we have been exploring with Japan, Singapore, and European markets. So I'll pause here about what India is trying to do right now and the infrastructure challenges.
Thanks, Ankur, for giving the perspective of India and what India is doing in terms of port readiness for hydrogen use domestically as well as for the export. I think I'll move on to you, Theopolina, because Ankur raised very good points on the investors. They would like to invest more in the individual infrastructure rather than the common user infrastructure, because that kind of constrain themselves. So since Namibia is one of the key players in hydrogen, as an emerging key player, I would put it like that, what are the challenges or like what are the lessons learned from your work on infrastructure planning, whether it comes to common user infrastructure or the individual infrastructure, and on the land acquisition as well? Because Ankur mentioned that Government of India, the Ministry of Ports, had earmarked some portion of land just for hydrogen use. So is Namibia planning is also planning on those lines, or you have something else to share?
For Namibia, we've also very early on in our strategy, which we call the Green Hydrogen and Derivative Strategy, we've mapped out 3 hydrogen valleys. And again, I don't like to call them hydrogen valleys anymore, because as a country, we've also moved away from saying hydrogen, because what we're looking at now is the green industrialization, not green hydrogen, because obviously that is all encompassing. So we have what we call the Southern Valley, where the Hyphen project is being developed or has been allocated land for feasibility studies. And then we have the Central Valley, where the rest of the projects are actually concentrated. And now when you think of the rest of the projects, we have roughly 6 projects that are being developed in the Central Valley, of which 3 have been commissioned, 2 are pilots, and then the 1 is industrial scale project. And then the Northern Valley, nothing is happening there yet. So that's just to give an indication of how we've sort of mapped out in our strategy on how we're going to go about developing the green, or at least driving the green industrialization agenda. Now, with that being said, yes, some projects, of course, prefer to build out their infrastructure just because, again, common user infrastructure, the timelines may not align with their individual timelines. And what we've done to understand how best we can approach the build out of common user infrastructure as a country is we commissioned a study called the Global Best Practice Common User Study, and now we've concluded that study. And in that study, we sort of mapped out an integrated framework for how the country will build out its common user infrastructure. Of course, also how do we then coordinate government, our SOEs, the utilities companies, as well as the developers, right? And now the outcomes of that study are ready, and they are quite interesting. And it speaks to your point that yes, although there's appetite for common user infrastructure, the pace and the timelines vary significantly. So those are some of the conversations that we are having with our government on how best we are going to drive this. And aside from that, one of the key things that we've learned, or at least to speak to the question on lessons learned in Namibia, is we've stopped planning for projects, and now we are planning for corridors. Because early on, what we've learned when we're looking at our valleys is there are so many conflicts. Land allocation has to be coordinated, because you can't have private developers develop projects on areas where there are massive conflicts with MLs, mining licenses, or prospective licenses, or even nature conservation. So we've looked at it, or at least what we're doing now is an approach where we are planning for corridors as opposed to planning for projects. So projects or investors can feel the comfort that as a government, there's initiative, or there's also work being done to minimize the burden on resolving those conflicts at a later stage. And the other thing that we're looking at as a country is permits. Because if you have international investors, or any investor for that matter, coming into the country and not understanding how best they are going to approach the licensing and the permitting of developing those projects, it becomes a massive challenge. So what we've done is we've mapped out, or we're in the process of actually concluding a permitting guide that speaks to the permitting of water infrastructure, that speaks to the permitting of your transmission infrastructure, your ECB, which is your electricity control board generation licenses, that speaks to the land allocation. What do you then do if you want a piece of land? How do you go about it? Because it just becomes an issue when an investor comes and then they don't know what the starting point is. So we've also mapped out a permitting guide for various investors. And the other lesson that we've learned very early on is on the benefit sharing and local content. When one plans for these projects, you need to have a social license to operate. So very early on, we've learned that that is a key driver for us. And for instance, one of our projects, when they came on board and they were allocated, actually for them to be allocated land, there needed to be incentives for the local communities. So shareholding matters as well, right? So you bring your people along. So benefits sharing as well as local content is another key lesson for us, as a country.
Thanks. No, I think it's very, very interesting. Thanks for sharing the Namibian perspective and what you're working on the guide and the common infrastructure. I move on to you, Charles, from a private sector, from an industrial gas supplier perspective. What makes common user infrastructure risky or attractive? And one linking question, so you can continue speaking, on the off-taking of hydrogen, because you also produce hydrogen. I mean, mostly gray, but also green hydrogen. You have some projects that you were mentioning. So maybe you can throw a light. Are you scared of your projects not being the hydrogen not being have enough off-takers? So do you have that scare in you? So you can take up these two questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Richie. So in terms of the common use infrastructure, as a private developer, you're going to spend a lot of time and effort, never mind the money, to invest in infrastructure that you may at some point be forced to give open access. So I'm going to differentiate between common use and open access. If open access is required, it's very, let's call it a very negative element potentially down the road for the private investors. So it's not easy to attract private investment where open access is going to be a requirement. In other words, you're going to have to allow your competitors or new entrants into the market to be able to use your infrastructure that you've spent a lot of time and effort developing. So that obviously is one of the concerns. The other one is as already mentioned by Anko, and I'm not going to go into them, but essentially you're not in control of your own destiny, in summary, as to what he was suggesting. So you want to be able to control your project timelines, and you want to be able to get the full benefit of the time and effort that you've invested. So how do you work this one out? So that comes to, yes, and to my earlier point, you need partnerships, but you've got to have partnerships along the value chain rather than multiple entry participants in any one component, because that's going to deter those investors. So the alternative to the private investors is government coming in and putting that common use infrastructure. But the challenge we have in South Africa, there's so many pools for investment in so many segments of society that for green hydrogen, it's not really going to be that easy for government to put money when there's still requirements on much more pressing issues in the country. So it has to come from private sector. So how do you attract private sector? You've got to give them the ability to compete. You've got to give them the ability to benefit from the infrastructure they've invested in. Otherwise, they're not going to do it. One concept that is used in some countries in the world is the build-own transfer mechanism. But for an entity that's already in the country and has a long-term focus, that's also not a very attractive scenario. yes, you'll get your money back. However, why spend 20 years on a project delivering the outputs, and in the longer term you're going to have to step back? So that's also not that attractive. So you've got to look at ways to allow the investors to recover their investment, be invested for the long term, and so unfortunately on the other side, if it comes to duplication, so every party needs to build their own infrastructure, that's going to cost more. And so you've got to find the right balance. You've got to optimize your investments in a way that avoids that duplication, but also allows the investors to get their returns on investment. So perhaps another element to this, in a very fledgling industry that's still in the early stage, you've got to allow a lot more openness for collaboration. So where I'm coming to here is in some geographies, competition compliance is a very sensitive topic, but actually some of the best projects are as a result of competitors collaborating with one another. So that freedom has to be there, so that the focus is on, as a region, how competitive can we be against other regions of the world, and not really internally focused, rather than focus on being as best as we can to be competitive in the global landscape. And then coming to your other question on demand, this is the biggest challenge, because in our view, being that we've been in the hydrogen space for 40, 50 years, I can't even recall now. I mean, we've been in South Africa for 56 years, because that's how old I am, but and globally a lot longer. And in all that time, we've been doing hydrogen. So it's not a new space to us. So on the production, supply side, and electrolyzers are new. I mean, we've had electrolyzers in South Africa for many decades. The fact of the matter is, it's just never been at the scale because the demand hasn't existed that we are now talking about. So the technology on the production side, whether it's to produce ammonia, whether it's to produce methanol, that all is tried and tested. Where the constraint lies, in our view, is just scaling it up, number one, where we've got like grid infrastructure constraints, and number two, creating that demand. And that's where the focus needs to go, because if the demand's there, you have private industry willing and able to put money in. And it's not a question of having to do demonstration projects and all of that. The demonstrations need to happen on the end user side. That we need to demonstrate to the market that hydrogen can be a better product, or green ammonia can be a cost-effective product for whatever reason it is, whether it's going into shipping, whether it's going into producing steel, whether it's going to producing fertilizers at the end of the day. That's a part of the value chain that really a focus needs to be put on, because I think as that demand exists, we have many, many suppliers willing and able to do that.
Thanks, Charles. I think we need one more panel discussion on the off-taking side, where we can have like this kind of debate on off-taking. You would like to add something, please?
Yeah. I just wanted to understand from Charles, and I 100% agree that some of the advantages that we speak about when we think of common user infrastructure is, of course, we don't want duplication. It reduces capex for individual projects, but also from an environmental perspective, it has less environmental impacts, right? Because you don't have a spaghetti effect of different pipelines just running across your land. But when you mention the challenge with open access, some of the models out there speak about cost recovery, right? So if you're a first mover, you build out your infrastructure, your pipeline infrastructure, or whichever infrastructure that other projects that come after you can potentially plug into. So I wanted to understand, if we want to maintain equitable use of infrastructure for various developers because you want them to have access, and also just it lowers barriers to entry for the market. Isn't that a model that will be more palatable for private sector? Because again, your concern was that you build out your infrastructure as a private developer and then other people come to enjoy your infrastructure. But if you're operating on a cost recovery method where you charge these tariffs to users of this infrastructure, I would imagine that would essentially be a palatable model for private developers. So maybe just your reflections on that.
No, I agree that's one way to deal with it, but it's not the most ideal from the private investor's perspective. But it's perhaps what I mentioned earlier, is finding the right balance. You can't have the duplication because that's just going to create cost and environmental issues, as you say. So I do agree that might be the right balance. But let me put it in context to throw out something that, to my point earlier, we've already got 160 kilometers of hydrogen pipelines in South Africa. We put this investment in over the last 20, 30 years. And if it becomes common use, the investments we made all those years ago when it wasn't attractive to be investing in the hydrogen space, now suddenly we're forced to. So we've borne the burden of having this investment in years when potentially we had the idea that it could one day develop. But honestly, nothing developed in the last 20 years. So that's a risk we took. Maybe it was foresight, but such foresight that it actually cost us in that it didn't really develop to what we thought it could at that point in time. So you can see the reluctance that if now this became common use, you're going to have. So we would need to get our return on investments that has been sitting in the ground for the last 20, 30 years. I'm just using that as a practical example of finding the right balance as to what Theolopilina mentions now. Thanks.
Thanks a lot to both of you. I think I'll move on to Thomas and do we have still Shannon here? Or she dropped out. Okay, but then maybe from you, Thomas, because you are working with Freeport Saldanha on this common user infrastructure, and of course, as Shannon was mentioning about this land constraint, that is difficult for this common use infrastructure versus the individual project needs. So. From your analysis, I think in CSIR you did some analysis on this common user infrastructure, whether it makes sense for only the larger ports or also the smaller ports with land constraints, and what is attractive for investors or decision makers. So if you can throw some light on that.
It's easy after listening to what Shannon said to have a certain idea in your mind about what the reality is. And the words she said were true, but the implication can be spun in multiple ways. Freeport does not have an available land problem. Freeport has an allowable land problem. The Saldanha has got a small SEZ around the port. It's a very delicate land area around that with which makes expansion or contiguous expansion of the SEZ problematic. But that's only if you insist on your SEZ being contiguous. If you move just a mere 5 kilometers in any other direction, you skip the really delicate part of the land and you get to usable land again. So what we are strongly encouraging Freeport to do is to not build major tank farm infrastructure in the SEZ. It's not far from population centers, and while building large ammonia plants near population centers are possible, it's not ideal in a new build scenario. So moving the tank farm maybe 5 kilometers away in non-contiguous area, which you could still define as SEZ, getting all the benefits for customs and for tax and whatever, but away from those communities. That then can be connected to the berth by means of a pipeline. So the tank farm is where you have the volume of ammonia. The pipeline is through which you move the ammonia, and in the event of a rupture, you have shut-off valves and whatever. So the risk of a plume is greatly reduced. So we're engaging with them saying, can this not be done? Some of the main problems are that you got multiple decision makers. SEZs report to the national government and to the local government, one for OPEX, the other one for CAPEX. So you need to corral a lot of decision makers into a room and to get a particular outcome decision. Transport National Ports Authority, that operate the ports, they then are a separate actor that require their own requirements, some of them statutory, some of them just mere competitive access. So you've got to manage all these highly human behaviors to get a shared outcome that is for the global good. And sometimes the requirement of an individual actor is not for the global good, but for the institutional good. Now you need to manage that internal conflict. That can be tricky. So in the SEZ, you have got, or rather in the area around Freeport, you have got, I think, 4 or 5 developers, and they have moved ahead in the absence of any public development. Now, if, as Charles said, if each of them now go and do their own thing, that now leads to a higgledy-piggledy process, which is not ideal. If you now impose a process from the top, you constrain their ability to respond to market opportunities. So what we are suggesting is from the tank farm to the port, that can be common user infrastructure that you require the state to have a role in. Access from the developers to the tank farm, you have options that you can do. Maybe 1 or 2 developers are prepared to collaborate on a particular access point. We would like to get away from the idea that everything is moved by road. It destroys road services, trucks, you have small volumes, it pushes your costs up. So that you're essentially talking pipelines, maybe a rail network, and then you have other actors that you need to bring in. So this is the real pain point here. It's not that something is inherently technically difficult. It is organizationally difficult. So local authorities, being a province, are often ideally placed in the sense that they are the ones that want to attract investment in order to move things forward. National sets national priorities, and clearly they look at national budgets and they want to attract various bits. But to make a particular project move forward, national may have their own priorities or preferences, but it's not really for them to go and make this one move forward. Whereas for the province it does. The province doesn't always have the authorities to do those things. And there are some authorities that are at local level. So the local level may have the authority to move on something, but not the capacity to do that, because they are local municipal authorities, and they are used to dealing with sewage and new road and whatever. And now you come with R1 billion infrastructure. They all remember, okay, you're not from South Africa, but we have the Zondo Commission of Inquiry, which has to do with corruption. And so you have a lot of honest local authority people terrified to make a decision because they've seen what happens on TV. So you want to be able to allow these decision makers to do their jobs in an area that they're not used to doing it. And provinces are good at doing that. In the Eastern Cape, for example, Alistair McMaster, particularly good at identifying this highly human situation that a particular approver is saying, okay, he's used to dealing with sewage, dealing with electricity, is R1 billion thing, he's terrified, he doesn't make a decision, so he doesn't make a decision. So then this R1 billion infrastructure stops. And then you get allegations coming, so, oh, it's internal corruption, it's this. No, it's just real unmitigated terror. And you want to find a way to allow this person to do their job in an area that they're not comfortable, they've not been exposed to, and this requires human effort and engagement. I don't know if that's helpful.
I think it's not a problem only in South Africa. I think it's global, and every country have their own challenges where you have, you have a central subject and a state subject, and then of course all the states do. So I think it's very well put, and thanks for giving that remark. I think Shannon is back here. Shannon, can you hear us? I wanted to ask her about the master plan and the role of Freeport Saldanha, whether you would want to be a global green hydrogen hub for export or for domestic use.
Thank you, Ruchi. So talking about the green hydrogen master plan, which CSIR is actually assisting us in rolling out for us, we recognize that the shared common user infrastructure is essential for unlocking scalable and scalability and investment. But we also understand that the individual projects have unique requirements. So we're balancing this with the adopted approach of modular and phased development approach, whereby anchor projects will drive the initial build-out of the catalytic assets, such as desalination, key site upgrades, pipelines, and or transmission. And from there, the smaller projects can plug into the infrastructure without duplicating any efforts. But because land at the port is very constrained at Port of Saldanha, we're also advancing a comprehensive spatial master plan that carefully allocates the zones for hydrogen, ammonia, and also e-fuels while safeguarding safe access and also environmental buffers and looking at logistical integration to ensure infrastructure is optimized and that we avoid fragmentation and create a level of playing field for multiple investors. So in short, our approach with regards to the master plan is to design a flexible ecosystem that enables both the large-scale global players and local industrial users to coexist and to thrive. But taking into consideration the roadmap to position Freeport Saldanha as a green hydrogen hub and or on a global level while allowing local demand creation is twofold. So we need to position as a global hub for exports while also anchoring local demand. So on the global side, we're leveraging Saldanha's natural deep water port, the newly announced industrial cluster. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, see if we can hear you. Yeah, Shannon, you can continue.
Okay. Yeah, so with regards to the positioning from a global level and local demand creation, we're leveraging Saldanha's natural deep water port, a newly announced industrial cluster, our first mover advantage as a hydrogen export hub, and the proximity to renewable resources to become an actual key export node for green hydrogen derivatives such as the ammonia and e-fuels, while aligning with initiatives like the World Economic Transitional Industrial Cluster, the green shipping corridor that we are playing into, and building partnerships with both the European and Asian corridors to ensure that our infrastructure is designed to meet international safety and certification standards. So in parallel, we're focused on the local demand creation that includes supporting decarbonization, but also integration of hydrogen into the local energy systems. So we've pulled out, or we're approaching a dual approach to reduce the risk and to ensure that Freeport is not only an export hub, but also a driver for inclusive industrial growth. Thank you, Ruchi. I don't know if you heard me, but I've tried to answer as comprehensively as possible.
Thanks, Shannon. No, we definitely heard you. I think now the mic is okay. Because we are running out of time, I would like to ask the audience if you have any questions. You can raise your hand and tell your name, from where you are, and you can ask to any panelists. So just opening the floor for question and answers. Yes, please.
Yeah, Mem Shogwa from University of Hong Kong, but I worked in Europe for decades. Yeah, so been involved in hydrogen production infrastructure for some time. The key question for South African region is the source for green hydrogen, because if electrolyzer to be used, water is very important, which is lacking. So are there considerations in the source of green hydrogen in the infrastructure consideration? Thank you.
If I could take that, sir. South Africa is generally water stressed. 2/3 of our country is water stressed. So for the CSIR, we take a general position that surface water should never be used for electrolysis. That it must always be contaminated water as a source. So if you're at the coast, seawater desalination just makes sense. Now, seawater desalination is normally an expensive water source for agriculture and for certain communities. But for hydrogen production, the cost is very nearly negligible. It contributes to the order of 1% of the final hydrogen cost, or somewhere between 2 and 5 US cents of kilograms of hydrogen. The trick is to make sure that the discharge of brine back into the ocean is done in an environmentally sustainable way. Now, the desalination is a study in its own right. It has its own... now, normally with desalination, your goal is affordable, potable water. And you are trying to cut costs, which means there's always a risk that the brine discharge is going to be suboptimal, and then that is going to bite you later. There's going to be some natural disaster. For hydrogen, however, because the costs are so small, you can afford to take a Rolls-Royce approach in your discharge. Because it doesn't make a significant fraction of your input costs, but gives you very good public relations in a dry area. You can oversize your desalination plant, make water available for the community in water-stressed areas, and therefore that additional extra cost to go and make for really good quality brine discharge is well spent. You buy good access with decision makers, with communities, and you make for a greater water resilience going forward. I hope that helps.
I think we can take one more question because we are running out of time. Anyone else? Okay, thank you.
Thank you for such a great, insightful panel discussion. My name is Nkuli Masingam from ESCOM. I think for me, just a curiosity, as I hear you stating all the challenges that are coming across, is there a view that maybe this is as a result of lack of representation of the hydrogen industry in the IRP? I know, Dr. Rebecca, you touched on it in your keynote address. The reason why I'm asking that also, I'm glad to see the lady from Namibia, sorry, just forgot your name, on the panel discussion with the recent withdrawal of the German company that had invested in there. Where there may be technicalities as the story unfolds, where there's no representation from a higher government level, where maybe investor confidence started to lack.
It's very unfortunate, the lack of hydrogen involvement in the IRP. It's also very unfortunate the lack of hydrogen involvement in the grid expansion. So in the ESCOM grid planning, it doesn't appear anywhere. And in IRP, it appears, but the assumption is the private sector is going to go and do it. Whereas it's inherently an ecosystem issue. So it would be really great to take that further, because I think to a certain degree, ESCOM is forced to fly blind. They know a whole lot of hydrogen infrastructure is happening. They know they're going to need to move a whole lot of electrons. It doesn't appear in any of their planning. So how to move that forward is going to require some further engagement.
No, I want to answer that question. I mean, it's alleged because Minister Ramahopa did say it a few weeks back that it is showing up in the IRP, but we won't know until we see the IRP 2025 that comes out in a few weeks. I think he said that they did take the IRP to cabinet, and then guys in cabinet were complaining and saying, where's this green hydrogen? And they said, go back and come back with some input. So I think it seems like it will happen, but we have to, it's still, I'm saying alleged because I haven't seen, the document hasn't gone live. So I think we should really say that it is thinking around that is happening. But then also, again, as I mentioned earlier, there's a shared infrastructure work stream that has been that is being put in place. ESCOM is a member of that, a very active member, as well as other organizations have been, like TMPA, the rail guys, the pipeline guys, all the CAPES, as well as other key stakeholders, NERSA and so forth.
I'll be very brief. On the RWE question, there has been, of course, a public withdrawal of RWE because they were a potential or strategic investor into the Hyphen project. But they've also come out and pronounced themselves and said that their reason for withdrawing has nothing, because initially speculation was that some of the traditional leaders of associations had gone to Germany to protest. Because again, this is why I was speaking and stressing a lot on social license to operate, because it's a key thing and it is a learning for us. But they've pronounced themselves and said that that's not the reason why they've withdrawn. They have said that they've withdrawn from many other projects. Hyphen is not a unique case because they're shifting strategy and their position. So it wasn't happy news for us as a country either. But again, we're just glad that it wasn't as a cause of our own traditional leaders going to protest. The markets are shifting, a lot is changing, and we are also now looking at CFT mechanisms on how best we can drive projects like Hyphen forward.
Thanks everyone. I think we are overshooting the time. So I would like to thank all the panelists here and also online. Thanks Ankur and Shannon for being here and participating. Sorry for the technical issue, but thanks a lot. I mean, I have many other questions to ask, but time is a constraint. But you can follow in the tea time, so you can still ask your questions with the panelists who are here. And I'm sure Ankur and Shannon can be reached through LinkedIn or other contacts and would be happy to answer your questions. Thanks a lot for being here, both of you. I would love to meet you in person. Shannon, Ankur, I know personally. So thanks everyone for joining in, and have a nice afternoon.